and millions are from hunger dying. The end the means is justifying, 'tis the final stand. So that was our contribution. Now, as I say,
we know that the 30s have several names. They call the dirty 30s and all kinds of names. And most people, when they think of the 30s, they think of things like dust storms, unemployment, the flats under Falls Creek being where the unemployed built sheltered themselves, so they called it the Falls Creek Flats. We're used to thinking of unemployment and all kinds of things, but very seldom do you see reports on what the people did about it. And I think that's what we're interested in today. How did they finally accept that this huge unemployment? I grew up on a farm in northern Saskatchewan, so I wasn't involved in the sort of events in the main centers. However, it's really surprising how much we were involved, because as a youngster, at age 12, I was already quite versed in what was going on against the Depression and how farmers were handling the problem, because you couldn't avoid it. I mean, farmers were organizing. And as you'll hear, there were all kinds of organizations set up. And in spite of the fact that we had no telephone, and for a long time not even radio, people knew what was going on. I think even more so than today, but just by word of mouth. I'd like to introduce Elspeth, who was involved in Vancouver. And Elspeth has practiced law some 30-odd years. 42 years in Vancouver.
I've already been retired for 20 years. I was born in Vancouver on the 23rd of August, 1921, and my parents were communists, and in a time when it was not that easy legally to be a communist, and there were difficult times about that, which I'll mention later. My father was really enthusiastic about the Soviet Union, and his enthusiasm he passed along to his children. There had been gathering unemployment, and in that period there was no unemployment insurance, there was no social assistance, there was no old age pension. Now my father was a street railwayman, and he worked all through the Depression. So there were people who were working, and he was one of them. But there was a growing number of unemployed, and it backed up into the young people terribly. And the solution of the Canadian government, as the numbers of young unemployed grew, the solution of the Conservative government was to take all those young men, isolate them from their communities, put them into labor camps, really, in remote parts, and ones I knew about were in British Columbia, but in all across the country as well. They paid them 20 cents a day, and they expected them to work for their room and board and what kind of accommodation they had. And so in the spring of 1935, in the springtime, the leaders decided that the time had come to make a move. And they went through all the camps and said, we're going to all go down to Vancouver and get some action going. This was a single unemployed. They had a single unemployed protective association, I recall, in addition to their actual union, as they called it. And they did come down to Vancouver in large numbers. And there were about 2,000 or 3,000 of them finally arrived in the Lower Mainland. They were there for May Day of 1935. And by that time, a lot of groups had come to their support. There were a lot of community organizations that had left-wing backgrounds. The Russian Federation, the Ukrainian Association, and there were also Swedish groups and Finnish groups, and all of those people were there prepared to help to get food and shelter for the young unemployed. In 1935, the young men were in Vancouver, and they were planning a trek to Ottawa to demand work and wages. And they planned to leave in early May. They decided to go in early May. May Day came in between. And on May Day that year, there were some 30,000 people who gathered in Stanley Park for the May Day gathering. Well, that year I was speaking at a meeting at night, but not at the gathering in Stanley Park. But I called up from the crowd to say for me to do something. Well, I hadn't prepared a speech for there, so I recited a poem again. And I won't say it all, but it was an anti-war poem, and anti-imperialist war too, because the young people were growing very afraid of an oncoming war threatening since the rise of Hitler. And so how did that go now? Let's see. We hear the call, and terror fills the heart. And then it says, we are the youth, young workers who must fight the bloody battles that our masters make to broaden out their fields of wealth. Upon our shoulders fall the burdens of brazen trickery. Seize the guns, beat them back, crush under heel the fascisti band. So that's just a portion of the song. But that got a very good response from the audience too. So, I mean, I think it's important to realize that there was a very different mood in the country and in the progressive movements, and that was largely because of the existence of the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet, in 1929, when the whole economic world crashed in the capitalist world, that did not happen in the Soviet Union. And in time, in the mid-1930s, there were great advances being made in the working conditions of the people, in an amazing situation when you think about it, when you think that there had been no background of democratic development in the Soviet Union. There had been a terrible war there in their part in the war. They were under terrific oppression. So they were developing a society that was actually providing for its people. That despite whatever other things may be said about the situation, that was the understood situation, and many workers in Canada knew about that. And in fact, my father in 1934, at the end of 1934, had gone to the Soviet Union on a 3-month tour, along with two other. He went from the Street Railwaymen's Union, and there were delegates from the Lumber Workers Union and the Longshoremen Union. And when they came back from their trip, they were met at the CPR station by about 1,500 people. That activity was also going on and becoming widespread. So it was in that kind of, and I myself heard from my father and was much influenced by what he had to say. And I should say, the Dean of Canterbury of the Church of England went to the Soviet Union around that time, and he wrote a pamphlet and said, I have seen socialism and it works. So, you know, a lot of that has been wiped out by the long years of, since the 1930s. And there you hear rarely the credit of what had been developed and what had been done. Of course, in the Second World War, the numbers that died in the Soviet Union, civilians and soldiers, were more than 20 million. Some have estimated it at 30 million people, 30 million, far more than all the combined losses in all the other countries that have taken part.